All right, so there are a couple of definitions of accessible. We have accessible as it relates to equipment, we have accessible as it relates to wiring methods, and then we have readily accessible. So let's take a peek. Accessible as it relates to equipment means that it's capable of being reached for operation, renewal, and inspection. And you might notice the underlined yellow text showing that this was a change in the 2020 code. In my opinion, it was a good change, and I'll explain the change here in 1 second. So looking at the picture here, this is equipment. It's not wiring methods, it's equipment, and it's accessible. We may have to kind of beat through the bush and everything to get to it, but it is in fact accessible. So this is accessible equipment. This also is accessible equipment. If we're talking about the connection from the grounding electrode conductor to the rebar, that is accessible because it is capable of being reached for operation, renewal, and inspection. If I were to drywall over that, it would not be accessible, and that would violate section 250.68, I believe, C. So that would be accessible. Previous versions of the code talked about it not being inaccessible by locked doors and things like that, and that was a problem for installations like townhouses. So for a townhouse, it's quite common if you'll have 4 or 5 units next to each other with a service at one end. It's quite common to have this exact scenario. You'll have the rebar sticking out in the basement of one of the units, and we'll connect a 4-gauge conductor to it, and that grounds the entire, all of the metal parts for the townhouse. Now, you couldn't access that fitting unless you went into an individual unit, and you had some inspectors saying that's not accessible because if the person that owns that specific unit isn't home, then I can't get to it. And I guess that's true. It was covered by locked doors because the owner of the unit might lock his or her door, but really that was not the intent of what we're trying to do. When it comes to accessible relating to equipment, capable of being reached for operation, renewal, and inspection. It doesn't say that it has to be easily reachable, it just says that it has to be reachable. So here, this meter socket enclosure is certainly not readily accessible, which we'll talk about here in one moment, but it is accessible. Okay, so if we compare accessible equipment to accessible wiring methods, they're actually quite similar. They used to be different, but in the 2020 version, we made them almost the same thing. Accessible wiring methods means that it's capable of being exposed or removed without damaging the finish of the building or structure and not permanently closed in by the building's finish. All right, so this is certainly accessible. We would also call this exposed wiring. If this was inside of the CMU units, inside of that masonry wall, then that would not be accessible. It would be concealed. But there you go, accessible, pretty much just not permanently covered by the surface of the building, not concealed by drywall, etc. Perhaps the most important definition here, though, is readily accessible, and that means that it's capable of being reached quickly without requiring a person to use tools other than a key, or climb over or under or remove obstacles, or use portable ladders and so forth. All right, so looking at this panel board back here, the circuit breakers inside of it are not currently readily accessible because I have to remove obstacles to get to it. So once I move that ladder out of the way, they would be readily accessible. So I don't have to use a tool. I don't have to climb over something or under something. I don't have to remove an obstacle. I don't have to use a portable ladder and so forth. Now, the issue with tools is somewhat new. I think they added that in the 2014 code, and then they had to clarify it in the 2017 code. What they were trying to eliminate is having to use a screwdriver to open something up. In previous versions of the code, it was allowed. So if I had to get a screwdriver and open that thing up, that was still considered readily accessible. Well, that's kind of a problem, because if I have to go all the way back to the truck to grab the right tool, because it doesn't necessarily have to be a screw like this, it could be a torque screw or something strained, a tamper-resistant screw. If I have to go all the way back to the truck to grab a special tool to open it up, is that really ready access? Is that capable of being reached quickly? Not really. So in the 2014, they said, look, if you have to use a tool to open it, that means it's not readily accessible. So what they were trying to do is to remove screws like this and replace them with a thumb turn, which is what they added. So now I can lift up the little latch, twist that with my fingers, and we're good to go. So a thumb turn is considered ready access. Now the problem that they had when they changed this code in the 2014 is that the definition of a tool in just Webster's Collegiate would include a lot of different things. And, if we're being honest, it would include a key. So we need to be able to lock things. I mean, looking at this photograph, we're all going to agree that you shouldn't be able to just open this thing up and stick your hand in there and get yourself killed or shut off the traffic signal. So we need to be able to lock things, but we also need to be able to access things. So they made a change saying, look, tools do not include keys for the purposes of this definition. And then they even added an informational note saying, look, using keys is a common practice and it is allowed. So there you go, accessible and readily accessible. Be sure to like, follow, subscribe, and ring the bell.